Good morning, everyone. I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to gather today on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. I'm grateful that you've all come here to listen to this session today. As you heard, my name is Rob McCann, and I am the founder of Clear Cable, where we're building better broadband for communities of all sizes. I've developed a bit of a reputation in the industry as a bringer of bad news, and today, hopefully, I will bring you some good news. That's what I've been working on for the last couple of years. But to do that, I'm going to take you back to 2016, in the time when I delivered bad news. And if we were in 2016, I would be showing you a graph that looks somewhat like this. This is a graph of a typical ISP and their bandwidth consumption, or how much is coming in from the internet. That's that top green line. How much are their subscribers consuming in total from the internet? And what I would point out to you at this section here, which is roughly 2015, there's a growth rate of the consumption of the internet of about 50% year over year over year. And this was actually true since 2002. We have data that goes all the way back there and says from 2002 to 2015, we had a growth rate of 50%. And the reason why this is interesting is because it means for a service provider, every year they need 7.5 times more capacity than they had last year. So you can understand why I developed this reputation for bad news, because it means they need to invest more and more and more in continuing to build the network. But I'd also point out to you here this little drop, right in the section in the middle. And that little drop, people say, well, what is that? That little drop is the implementation of a Netflix cache. And you see that right there at the middle of 2015, we stick a Netflix cache and the consumption of the internet goes way down. In fact, around that time, Netflix accounted for almost 70% of the bandwidth of any service provider across the country. And we hoped, of course, this would slow things down, but then in 2016, we see that things actually grow a little bit faster. People start consuming more. This is where the good news comes in. Towards the end of 2016, you see that graph start to trail off a little bit and sort of stabilize. And in fact, if I fast forward you now to 2016 to 2019, you'll see that that growth rate has actually stabilized somewhat. Today, our service providers are seeing compound growth in the order of 30 to 40%. So there's a lot of things going on there. How come? How come we stopped seeing so much growth? Well, one of the reasons is this right here. This is a graph off of a typical Netflix cache just from last week. And what you see is that Netflix is flat growth. Flat. One of two things has happened from an economic point of view. Perhaps Netflix content has gotten stale. Anybody knows that lately? Right? Not a lot to watch, right? But second of all, what I contend is that we've reached peak video. In other words, we are consuming so much entertainment online that we don't have any more time left to consume anymore. Right? And that's essentially what is going on. But I also want to make sure that you understand that video is the killer application for the internet. We've heard some great stories about online pharmacies. That's fantastic. The opportunity for people to get distance education in their rural communities, that's dynamite. The ability for them to Skype with their grandkids or with other folks around the world, awesome. But the reality is the consumption of the internet is video. Over 70% of the traffic that we see on our networks today is streaming. And we see Netflix, which used to be most of that traffic, is now down to about 24%. The big one that's coming up, of course, is Google, right? They're the owners of YouTube. So YouTube and those related properties. But we're also seeing some of the other content distribution networks start to grow. Now, late last night, I was hunting out Amadeo because I wanted to change a couple of slides. Does anyone know why some of this information might have changed yesterday? Disney Plus, yeah, Disney Plus. So I got the hot off the press details from our tech team this morning. What we observed was the Netflix cache data roughly down about 30%. So we're assuming about 30% of subscribers have tried to go over to Disney. We've noticed that the transit links across our service providers have not increased beyond what we would have expected. And it was something we were greatly concerned about because we know that Disney is using Akamai as one of their content distribution networks. But it turns out Disney was down most of yesterday because they didn't expect so many people to come on board. But really and truly, yesterday is a game changer. And that is because the online catalog of Disney is so huge, and the depth of what they have in their back catalog is so deep. And not only will it end with Disney, but we know that NBC Universal and Warner are all stacked up right behind. So why do you even care about this, right? Despite all of the really great applications that are out there for internet and rural communities, it's always going to be video that's going to drive bandwidth consumption. And that means that this period of slower growth is likely to continue, because even though we bring on more of these streaming applications, people just don't have more time to be able to consume them. So we'll continue that slower growth. And that slower growth also means that the traffic is likely to stay asymmetric. In your communities, I often hear folks say, well, I need to have the same bandwidth down as I have up. But you don't really. You don't. Consumers are consumers of content. They are not contributors of content. And no matter how much we try to generate in our homes, we're never going to be able to generate the amount of capacity that it takes to stream even one super HD movie into the home. So we'll always have asymmetric traffic, which really means that the CRTC's limits, or the CRTC's guideline of 50/10 is likely to be sufficient for now. In other words, I don't foresee an application coming down the pipe that is going to really need to consume more than that in the relative near term. This is all positive because it potentially takes the heat off the incumbent providers. So everyone who's out there as a service provider today knows they've been making massive investments in continuing to grow their networks to support that rapid growth that was going on in bandwidth consumption, and now there may be a little bit of breathing room. And despite the sort of political positioning that we see in the market today, I suspect that will lead several of our top tier providers to be able to expand some investment into some of the underserved areas in the relative near term, offering more investment for the remote areas. It also means, interestingly enough, that the technology that we have today is likely sufficient. In other words, we don't have to wait for some breakthrough technology. We don't have to hold off for something new to solve our problems. We have the technology that we need today to be able to deliver it. And those technologies are really basic and simple. We have wireless networks. If we're living in the sort of third generation or fourth generation world, we would have WiMAX or LTE in the licensed and unlicensed zone. We may be heading towards 5G, a little bit more on that later. But certainly we're seeing the need to make investments in physical tower infrastructure to be able to deliver to those places that are difficult to reach otherwise. And the second one is fiber to the home. Whether you're choosing GPON or EPON today, running fiber to the home gives us that opportunity to be future-proof and be able to deliver the services that our subscribers need, eventually moving to NG-PON, 2 XGS-PON, and 10G EPON, but again, not necessary. And this means that as a community or as a service provider, you're actually making investments in intensive terrestrial infrastructure. You're digging up roads, you're digging trenches, you're pushing fiber all around your area. And of course, there are hybrid approaches that might be necessary or convenient to use. A little bit of both in each place. To give you some examples, this is one of our customers, Detour Wireless, which is an independent entrepreneurial operation where they literally put up towers in remote, or not really remote, but rural areas. And I know you're looking at the map and you see Hamilton there and you say, excuse me, Hamilton is not rural. But the reality is that almost 70% of the land area in Hamilton is rural. Even though most of the population is in the city, of course. But you see the pictures of where Detour Wireless places their towers, or the markets that they serve. And the reason I put this up is to show you that this is very intensive. It's very a deep investment in order to be able to go out and put towers in these places, because towers are big, difficult things. Here's the owner climbing up the tower in order to put on his little transmitters. That tower happens to be only 160 feet. But there are several investments that are necessary to build out infrastructure. And in your communities, there are likely enterprising entrepreneurs who are interested in doing that. They may be landowners, local farmers, they're anybody who is able to contribute and service the community. So that's one thing that we see coming about. Taking that to the extreme, this is one of the Intelligent Community Forum's communities, Smart 21s, Parkland County in Alberta, which is a rural area. What's interesting about Parkland County is they have about 13 people per square kilometer over a 2,400 square kilometer area. And you can imagine how difficult that would be for any ISP to be able to service on wireless or on fiber. Well, they came up with a very creative solution. The actual county decided to put up the tower infrastructure. And those little bubbles you see are where all of the towers are. And then the municipality connected all of those towers together via fiber, and they offered that to the local entrepreneurs. They could rent space on those towers, so the entrepreneurs didn't have to make that investment to build and support and maintain the tower, but they could get onto that tower and then be able to service subscribers. Very, very successful means to get services out into an area that wouldn't otherwise be there. Now, if you're a municipality and you're thinking, wow, I have no idea how I would possibly do that, the good news is there's lots of people in the industry who would be able to help make that construction happen and build it out and support and operate it on behalf of the municipality. But there is certainly value in both de-risking the operators by making that investment, but also owning the infrastructure as a community. Now, slightly different tact. This is Quadrille Communications. They were the 2016 Clear Cable Broadband Provider of the Year. They embarked on an 8-year journey with an investment of $20 million to service every farm, barn, residence, business in their communities. So everywhere where you see red up there, they have fiber to the home. It's 3,100 different residents. And what's even more interesting about this is that they have since partnered in the town of St. Mary's with the local community-owned fiber asset Rhizome networks in order to deliver services, fiber to the home, to everybody in St. Mary's as well. So this is an example of finding creative partnerships and making investments to be able to build out and support and operate the community. So when people tell me that they can't build fiber to all the farms, I say that's not true. You actually can, and these are a set of folks who have actually done it. Again, there are solutions in the town of St. Mary's. Perhaps they don't need to build it because the community is helping with the construction, but certainly there are opportunities to do that. And again, this is something I want to make sure you understand is physically intensive, right? There they are plowing out to a barn right now to put that fiber in. So as a municipality, if you're thinking about this, you may not have the machinery or the mechanics to be able to build out this network, but what you need to do is either find the partner who is going to build that for you, or look to your local service providers and help de-risk them by implementing some of this. And it could be just as simple as putting in the conduit, all the places that it needs to go, so that the operators can then come in at a lower risk to be able to service those end subscribers. And cooperation is essential. So I know many people are saying, well, why don't we just wait for 5G? 5G is going to solve all of our problems. We won't have to do anything anymore. And that's just simply not true. 5G is the 5th generation standard of wireless service. You'll see that there are 2 different frequency ranges. Frequency range 1, which is in the 6 gigahertz range. Frequency range 2, which is greater than 24 gigahertz. It is massive, multiple input, multiple output, so that we can transmit on more channels. We have beamforming technology, so we can aim directly at end users. And reality is frequency range 1 is being deployed, licensed and deployed today. But it is very crowded spectrum because we see all sorts of things like remote control toys and stuff that use that same kind of frequency range, but it is out there and being deployed. In the real world, frequency range 1 allows for larger channel bandwidths than we would have seen in traditional 4G or LTE. And so the real world performance theoretically should be better than 4G. It's not 100 times better though. It is only really 40 to 100 megabits per second for a real world experience. It has the similar operating frequencies as LTE, so it needs the similar cell size. So in other words, you put up the same amount of towers as you did in 4G, and you get a little bit faster speed. And we'll see that happen. But of course, that is the most likely deployment scenario for a rural community because we have to cover very large distances, right? And frequency range 2, because it is a higher frequency, it doesn't quite go the same distances. Yeah, when we talk about gigabit services, we're talking about those bigger bandwidths at those higher frequencies, but we also have to have much smaller cells, right? It's higher frequency, lower range. Where a tower today in frequency range 1 would go the same as LTE, we're talking about maybe 1/10 of the size or distance on a tower in frequency range 2. So we need to have more towers. It's purely line of sight, which means that there are obstructions that may get in the way for frequency range 2. Weather has a very significant impact. So if it's snowing or raining, frequency range 2 will be degraded. Foliage is a big problem. I've heard there's trees in rural areas, so that's something we have to deal with. And then building construction is also a challenge for frequency range 2. It's difficult to get signals through buildings, so we need to put antennas on the outsides of the buildings. Our networks become just a little bit more complicated. And of course, there is the ongoing debate over whether this is healthy to be beaming us with all of these microwaves. So there's some big problems, and I repeat, foliage is a big problem. Just to show you here, if we have this particular macro tower in the middle and we're using 5G, we're trying to reach all of these mobile users, but they happen to be hiding behind these trees, we can't actually get the service to them. So what we would do is deploy small cells, and small cells look kind of like this. Off of the macro tower, I have these little tiny towers with these little small cells that are much closer to the user, and then I can get to their mobile devices and to their home and whatnot. But the reason why I put this picture up is because when you look at it, you see it starts to look an awful lot like Parkland County. Lots and lots and lots of towers that need to be managed and maintained and operated and supported. So as a community, you need to think about that. Is this something that the municipality is going to do entirely independently? Certainly you have the real estate available to be able to do that. Or are you going to find a partner company out there who is going to do that for you and support it and operate it? Or are you going to rely on the service providers to go ahead and do that? It's a very difficult question to sort out in your particular specific markets. In the end, though, it's just all infrastructure, right? So now you know that you're going to have to deploy more diverse networks. You're going to have to mix fiber and wireless in order to get services delivered to where you need it. One single solution is not going to solve all of the problems. You're going to have to make more investment. And that's where my bad news comes back in again. This stuff doesn't come for free. We have to find the money. One of my favorite examples is Winkler, Manitoba, where they wanted fiber to the home. So the city took $500,000 out of their reserve fund and used that along with some real estate to fund some local entrepreneurs to build a fiber to the home network. And so cities and municipalities need to think about that. Where does the money come from? Yes, there's a CRTC broadband fund. There's federal money that will begin to flow. There's going to be provincial money, but what is happening at the local community is the biggest challenge, so we have to find that investment. And then the good news for rural and remote communities is this is a massive opportunity for more jobs or more people to have more jobs and more training, particularly in those rural communities where, say, the mining operation has shut down, but they're still there 46 years later. The new jobs aren't necessarily there for the youth. The youth don't stay, they move to the city. In building a service provider operation, we have an opportunity to employ those folks and give them a local job in the community. The number one message for anyone here who is in a municipality is you need to simplify and facilitate access for the service providers. I hear so many times service providers say, we're waiting on the permit, or our permit got rejected, or this area of town is too complicated to service, or there's too many regulations that prevent us from servicing this area. And so as a city, as a community, you need to get around that and find the ways to make it more enticing for the operators to build, because they will build wherever it's easy to build rather than build where it's difficult. And lastly, if all else fails, definitely consider community assets or building an entire operation yourself. So community assets, I mean, potentially you could be installing the conduit to allow the service providers to come, and the community could own that asset. Or if in a void of service, you could actually build your ISP operation yourself and deliver that broadband as a community. No matter what you do, when you go home today, you need to start building that capacity. I'll be here for the next 2 days, and I welcome any questions through the day, and I appreciate your attention today. Thank you.